Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you books this time to read over second breakfast. There's no debate. Welcome back to the channel. For this month, I figured since last month was literally a different year, I would go into detail describing talking about the top 5 best books that I read in the year 2022. So the rules of this are going to be pretty simple. The first, note, this is my own personal list. This is going to be the books that I read in 2022 rather than books that were released or published within 2022. Now, these are, for the most part, these are going to be the ones that I've mostly reviewed on my channel. There's only a couple in here that I read before I started my channel, so beware of that. The second rule is it has to be a full-length novel that I bring in here. I read some amazing short stories. However, I don't think they qualify as a book by themselves. So for the specifics of this list, I'm going to be talking only about the best books. However, short stories can make it onto the honorable mentions list, so keep an eye out. Number 3. It has to be a book that I read for the first time last year. This means that I can't just choose a bunch of books for my nostalgia month that ended up holding up well, like Lightning Thief or Holes. I have to talk about the new books that I read this year, or that year, to talk about the best books of that year. Because The Land was a book I had already knew was good going into it, so it wasn't really something I discovered. With those rules down, I see no reason to delay. And just remember, again, this is my own personal list. You may or may not agree with what I put on here. However, this is merely my opinion on what is the best books that I personally read. So, without further ado, let's get into this. Number 5. Dark Life by Kat Falls. This young adult novel was a book that I read before I started my channel. To give some explanation, this is basically a young adult post-apocalyptic novel. I know, right? Most of you are already like, oh great, another one of those. But this book takes place in the post-apocalypse society, although it does something unique. Instead of them trying to live necessarily in the ruins of the old civilization with new rules, what they've done is the story follows basically a group of settlers who have decided, since most of the on-land world can no longer be lived upon safely, they've decided to go under the ocean and have formed big settlements down there, which not only provide stuff to them, but stuff to the people on land as well. The book follows a young man who discovers a surfacer girl who basically came down. And when he finds out that she is both afraid of water and can't swim, he can't help but get involved and try to help her look for her brother, the reason she's down there. Now that's pretty much all I'm going to say without spoiling, so I'm going to do my best not to spoil. But this book is very refreshing in the world of the young adult novels. The protagonist, while somewhat unlikable at times, is a refreshing read in the sense that he has a personality beyond being the blank slate for you to adopt on, but also not so much of a jerk that you really don't want to read about him, like I had the issue with Eli Yananakis in The Compound. There's a justifiable reason why he's the way he is. The connection between him and his pseudo-protagonist, the young girl he finds, also is very good, and the chemistry between them is really well written. The villain doesn't just exist simply to be evil as well, so that was a nice refreshing change of pace, especially with young adult novels, which tend to just skimp on villain motivations. There's also a nice undercurrent of politics that adopt throughout the whole story as people try to live with each other from both on land and off land. And there's twists in this book that, while may seem obvious on a reread, you won't really probably guess through the first read. Now, obviously, this is at number 5 still because it is still kind of a young adult novel, and in a sense, it's good despite the tropes that are constantly in young adult novels, rather than because of them. So keep that in mind if you decide to pick this up, but this book is a really good young adult novel, and my biggest complaint about it was that it was just too short. I felt like the author could have used another 50 or 60 pages to really make the story come to life, especially near the ending. So, with that, we move on to number 4. Number 4, The Dresden Files, Summer Night. My history with the Dresden Files is a little bit complicated. I read the first one, Stormfront. I read the first one, Stormfront, and while I liked it well enough, I kind of was disappointed with how much the detective part of this detective urban fantasy was not very well written. I like the world itself, I like the characters, and I like the story, but I did not like the mystery. And this series was sold to me based on being a urban fantasy mystery series. In the first book, mind you, the mystery is easily solved, and honestly, our main character Harry Dresden misses a couple of so obvious things. Even with head trauma, I have to wonder, is he stupid? But I put that to the side because that was the first book, and its purpose was more to show the world and the characters rather than necessarily really going all out on the mystery in the first start. And that was fine. Then the second book, also disappointed, because while the mystery was harder to solve, there was no way to solve it, and it was only solved by Dresden by a chance encounter. And then the third, but it was still good. It was still better than the first book, so I kept going. Then the third one. The third one also had a really bad mystery, because they did the thing where they tell you, it can't possibly be this. And it turns out it was that all along. And that's basically, they kept the mystery by lying to you. There was also a couple issues with the third book that I made it dislike it a little more than the second one, but again, still good. And then I read Summer Night. Summer Night solidified my love of the series because it is both a decent mystery, not great, I'm not gonna lie, not a great mystery, but a good mystery for it. And it also had a very compelling narrative on top of that. It does its best with its characters in this book as well. And although there's a few things here and there I could have done without in this book, I think this is the book that officially solidified I like the Dresden Files. With that, I'm going to say the fourth best book I read in the year 2022 is the Dresden Files, Summer Night. The books from here on are books I've actually reviewed on my channel, so don't worry about it. You guys will know what's coming up next. Number 3. Number 3 is The Last Policeman by Ben H. Winters. The Last Policeman was one of my last reviews that I put out on the year of 2020. It was one of those small casual reviews where I mostly just talk about the book instead of doing my typical style. And I picked it up because it sounded like a very interesting premise. That being, a detective is trying to solve a murder 6 months before the world ends. And honestly, I wasn't disappointed. Of all the detective novels that I had read this year, yeah, you guys, for those of you who've watched my channel, you've seen my attempts to get in detective fiction and how badly that's failed. Trust me, there's even more that you'll see in the next list coming up, but for the most part, my detective fiction forays were just very disappointing, from the a failed detective to the boring nature of something like Murder in the First Degree. However, The Last Detective managed to be both a detective novel and a sci-fi soon-to-be apocalypse book very well, at least in my opinion. I liked how the characters worked really well within the setting, and the setting was bleak, but not so bleak that there was no reason to care about what was going on. I also like some of the philosophy that was stated, although I do admit that depending on your philosophy, the book and the main character may become more annoying than endearing, so that's a fair warning for you guys. But overall, if you want to see my true opinions on the book, I suggest checking out my video on it. For that, number 3, Ben H. Winters, The Last Policeman. Number 2, Star Trek, The Next Generation, Ghost Ship. This was one of the earlier reviews I did on my channel back when I was still trying to figure out my style and back when I was still trying to do my thumbnails in a way that I was satisfied with. Now, The Next Generation, the Star Trek The Next Generation is an expanded universe novel in the world of Star Trek, obviously. And it was honestly one of the perfect examples of an expanded universe book that I could find. Now, this might be because that, from what I found out, the book was actually published before the Next Generation came out. And that might have lended to how it was written rather than how it might have been written afterwards, where you would have had a source material to pull from a lot more. That being said, it still is a very good book, even aside from that. It deals with a nice, complicated issue. It talks about it. The characters jump off the page and feel real. As someone who hasn't watched a lot of The Next Generation despite wanting to, I actually felt like I knew these characters by the end of the book, rather than just, yeah, these were the characters that existed, but what about them did I learn? And I would honestly say that it would enhance my experience if I was to go into the next generation and watch the series. And not just because I'm pretty sure this is the book that gave Matt Groening that Futurama episode idea.
Can people who hate Star Trek leave?
Good question.
No, you have to stay even longer.
But personally, this was a great read for me as someone who's always wanted to get into Star Trek but has never had the time or the ability to do so when I do have the time. So for that, I would say The Next Generation Ghost Ship is one of the best books I read this year. Only beat out by... Before we get to number one, let's do some honorable mentions. You can consider these honorable mentions basically the 5, 6, 7 books, if they had matched the quality. Now, obviously, I'm going to leave off the ones that I'd already read before, because that just still isn't fair. Otherwise, The Land would have easily beaten out everyone for number one spot. Without further ado, here's some honorable mentions. Time Salvager by Wesley Chu. A small book I read in the background while early on in my channel. Time Salvager is a story about a time traveler who goes back in time in order to basically salvage from important points of history to help extend the life of his doomed future. Now, the future is real crap sack. But however, during one of his jumps, he decides that he can't just leave behind people he knows are doomed to die, because the only points in history he can jump to are points where the thing he's taking was assumed to be destroyed and all the people inside were either killed or can't remember the events. There's some things here and there that I think the story kind of flubbed on. One of the issues I do personally think that, obviously one of the issues is it has to deal with time travel a lot. And there, for the life of me, is not a single time travel story without at least one hole in it. Even the best ones out there have at least one hole in it. So obviously you got to deal with that going into it. There's also some issues where the book can kind of drag in the middle. But overall, I think it's a unique story with a unique premise and very likable characters. If I had to put it on a list of 10, I would probably put this at 8. Night Gardener by Jonathan Auxier. The Night Gardener was a great read for me because it honestly told me that children's horror fiction can be good. Actually, children writing in general. I say children's novel. It's more of a young adult novel, in my opinion. But children's novels, especially horror, have the opportunity to be decent outside of just it's for kids. Now, I've never liked that excuse. I never like something is bad, but it's just for kids, so it doesn't matter. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for. However, this book really doesn't treat your kid dumb like a lot of the other books I've talked about. There's a real danger for the characters. There's a real complicated issue that they deal with. And for the most part, it's a very good and tonally consistent book with decent characters. If you're looking for a good children's horror book to check out this year, I'd probably put this about 7. Play Your Hand by Sarah Clancy. The only reason this story isn't on the list at number 2 or 1 is because it is a short story that I read within the Tavern of Terror, Volume 1, Scare Street. This is a short story about a carnival psychic who has an unexpected visitor in both death and someone else who came to his tent. So this is actually a very interesting story. The way that the author writes it, the suspense just keeps building and building. She makes clever choices with the psychic's powers. And it's overall a good book. I don't want to say any more due to it being a short story, but I highly recommend you check it out. Finally, number 1. Firestarter by Stephen King. Yeah, those of you who've seen my channel probably know this was coming. Firestarter was one of my earliest reviews, number 3 if I'm not wrong. Firestarter is honestly one of the best books I've read this year. I love the dynamic that Stephen King created between Andy McGee, the father doing his best to ensure that his daughter is safe, often looking to her as the only reason he's still hanging on despite his extremely dire and painful circumstances, to the innocent Charlie McGee, who has powers untold in this world, but doesn't want to hurt people because she can't control it very well. And watching as she sort of loses some of that innocence throughout her life as she's forced to run from the government agents at the shop. Or even John Rainbird, who is a terrifying villain, not because he kills a lot of people, but because he takes a disturbing obsession with Charlie McGee and manipulates her in a way that is very reminiscent of grooming a child. And overall, the story is just a very tense, good read by Stephen King. I really recommend that you pick it up and read it yourself. I don't recommend the movies, especially the 2022 one. Like, I watched that and just, what? What? Yeah, that's just awful. Don't watch the 2022 movie. The first movie, maybe, that kind of follows the book, but, I mean, it hasn't aged well. That's all I'm going to say. But yeah, if you have to pick up any one of these books that I recommended, I would recommend this one first and foremost. That's my list of the year 2022, the best books that I had read that year. What do you think of the list? Do you agree with it? You have a couple arguments to be made? What about your list? What is your list of the best books you read in 2022? I'd love to know, so please leave a comment down below describing to me what your best books are, or arguing the points that I made. I mean, I'm always interested to have a spirited debate. And while you're at it, hey, why don't you like and subscribe here as well? It helps the channel quite a bit. But without further ado, it's time I sign off. I'll see you guys in the next review or list, whichever goes up first. Just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and these adventures are definitely worth having. See you around.